Hello there. Whether we have shared many evenings together or tonight is our very first time crossing paths. I am so glad you are here. Go ahead and dim the lights. Pull the blanket up a little higher. Let the room go completely quiet. And just breathe. Tonight, we are going to travel back in time. Not to a battlefield, not to a grand throne room, but somewhere far more intimate. We are slipping behind the locked chamber doors of Europe's palaces to uncover the hidden lives of royal women. We will follow the hushed midnight affairs, the illegitimate children spirited away in the dark, and the queens who quietly vanished when they became too inconvenient. These are the silenced whispers that truly shaped the successions of empires. And history class never told you any of this. It all starts in the shadowed corridors of a medieval shadow, where one young bride realized her greatest secret was her only means of survival. To understand how a secret could be kept in a space entirely populated by other people, you must first look at the stone itself. The medieval royal shadow was not merely a residence. It was a fortress, constructed with outer walls that were sometimes 10 feet thick. Within these massive, damp barriers of limestone and mortar, an entire secondary geography existed. Behind the grand public galleries were courtiers in velvet and silk, paraded under the light of wax torches. There ran a network of narrow, unlit passages. These were the servant corridors, carved directly into the masonry. They were perpetually cold, smelling faintly of old wood ash, lye soap, and the stagnant water of the moat. They were entirely devoid of natural light, requiring anyone who walked them to trail a hand along the rough, chilled stone to find their way in the pitch black. These passages were designed for pure utility. They allowed maids with heavy brass basins of hot water, boys carrying armfuls of rough-barked oak firewood, and laundresses bearing heavy wicker baskets of linen to move invisibly through the palace. A servant could travel from the roasting spits of the kitchens in the lower bailey all the way up to the queen's private wardrobe without ever crossing a public hall. But this architecture of domestic invisibility served another, quieter purpose. A heavy timber door designed for a chambermaid to slip away unnoticed was also a door through which someone else might arrive unseen. In the dead of night, when the castle settled into a heavy silence, broken only by the wind rattling the wooden shutters, these narrow passages became the arteries of quiet indiscretion. At the end of these hidden stone pathways lay the royal bedchamber, a room that was surprisingly crowded by modern standards, yet intensely private in its physical construction. In the 14th century, a queen did not sleep in an open, airy room. The bed itself was often built into a deep, recessed alcove in the wall, functioning almost as a secure room within a larger room to keep out the pervasive, bone-chilling draft that seeped through the leaded glass windows. The bed was surrounded by heavy, layered curtains of serge or velvet, which could be drawn tightly shut. Inside the alcove lay deep feather mattresses and heavy woolen blankets, scented with dried lavender and wood smoke. The walls of the surrounding chamber were draped in thick, heavy wool tapestries. These monumental woven works, depicting dense hunting scenes or the lives of saints in muted greens and faded blues, were hung a few inches away from the stone to prevent them from rotting in the damp. Their primary function was insulation, trapping the meager heat from the hearth, but they possessed a secondary, crucial quality for those with things to hide. The dense, tightly woven wool absorbed sound. A footstep across the rush-strewn floorboards, the rustle of a linen chemise dropping to the ground, the low murmur of a hushed conversation. All of it was swallowed by the heavy textiles. In these rooms, a secret did not echo down the hall. It simply sank into the woven wool and disappeared. Yet the architecture of secrecy was not built of stone and fabric alone. It was maintained by the women who occupied the spaces in between. A royal bride was rarely entirely alone. She was surrounded day and night by her ladies-in-waiting, women of noble birth, who served as companions, dressers, and silent guardians of her daily routine. In the evening, as the daylight faded to the dim amber glow of the hearth, these women would sit for hours on low wooden stools, their heads bowed over wooden embroidery frames. They were the silent observers of the chamber. They listened to the crackle of the oak logs, the rhythmic, soothing pull of silk thread through taut linen, and the quiet breathing from the alcove bed. They knew the precise scent of the king's spiced pomander, and they knew when the careful footsteps approaching from the servants' stairwell belonged to someone else entirely. Their loyalty to the queen was absolute, woven into the very fabric of their own survival at court. If a stranger slipped through the narrow servant's door, perhaps disguised in a rough woolen cloak. The ladies in waiting simply kept their eyes fixed upon their needlework, maintaining the quiet order of the private rooms meant seeing everything and repeating absolutely nothing. They managed the physical evidence of the night. It was the ladies who disposed of the soiled linens, who smoothed the feather mattresses before morning, and who ensured the heavy oak doors were bolted from the inside. They understood the stakes of their silence. A misplaced word, a curious glance from a laundry maid, or a sudden noise in the corridor could mean ruin, exile, or the executioner's block. And so, they cultivated a profound stillness, blending perfectly into the quiet, tapestried walls around them. The silence they maintained was not merely a matter of discretion, but a necessary counterweight to the intense, almost suffocating scrutiny placed upon the Queen's physical form. Every aspect of her body was a matter of state, observed not just by the quiet servants blending into the shadows, but by the watchful, calculating eyes of the court physicians. These men moved through the royal apartments with a slow, deliberate authority, their presence marked by the rustle of heavy robes and the soft thud of leather-bound ledgers carried beneath their arms. Within the thick vellum pages of these ledgers, the bureaucracy of conception was recorded with meticulous, unyielding detail. A queen's body was a vessel of succession, a political landscape to be mapped and managed, and therefore every minor fluctuation in her temperature, every subtle shift in her appetite, and the exact timing of her physical cycles were documented in dark iron gall ink. The ledgers noted how many hours she slept, the quality of her rest, whether she favored the left or right side of the bed, and the precise composition of her morning meals. The physicians would feel her pulse at the wrist, noting its rhythm, searching for the earliest, faintest signs of a royal heir, or the lack thereof, to optimize the chances of conception. These medical men prescribed complex diets meant to balance the four humors of the body. There were days of eating heavily spiced roasted meats, dusted with ginger and cloves, intended to warm a constitution that had been deemed too cold and damp. On other days, she was given delicate, lukewarm broths of capon and almond milk to soothe a restless stomach or cool an overheated humor. Her daily habits were curated with mathematical precision. From the hour she walked in the gardens to the the temperature of the water she used to wash her face. Even the air she breathed was managed and medicated. Near the royal apartments stood small, heavy wooden apothecary chests, their many shallow drawers tightly fitted and labeled in faded Latin script. Opening these chests released a dense, complex fragrance into the drafty stone corridors, a scent that lingered in the tapestries and the heavy velvet curtains. It was the smell of dried herbs, harvested in late summer and hung in dusty bundles from the ceiling of the still room. There was the sharp, dry scent of bitter chamomile, routinely steeped in hot water to calm nerves frayed by the relentless, watching eyes of the court. Kept carefully in the lower drawers of these chests was the distinct, sharp, minty aroma of crushed pennyroyal. Pennyroyal was a common enough herb in the medieval and early modern world, yet one with highly specific, potent applications. While it was often scattered among the rushes on the floor to drive away fleas, it was also deeply understood by midwives, apothecaries, and court physicians to affect a woman's cycle. In the quiet pages of the ledgers, a sudden prescription of strong pennyroyal tea might be recorded simply as a necessary remedy for sluggish digestion or a blocked humor. But in the shadowed reality of the royal apartments, it was sometimes administered to bring about a delayed monthly cycle, quietly resolving an inconvenient pregnancy before it could take hold, turning a potentially fatal scandal back into a simple matter of health. The scent of it, sharp and green, would cling to the fingers of those who prepared it. Beyond the physician's ledgers and the apothecary's wooden drawers, the most undeniable records of a queen's condition were kept far below the royal chambers, in the laundry, deep in the damp, echoing stone rooms of the wash house. The royal household's linens were processed. This was a daily, laborious chore. The heavy, embroidered linen bedsheets, stripped from the royal bed each morning by the chamberers, were carried down the narrow servant stairs in large woven baskets. Down in the wash house, they were plunged into large copper vats of boiling water, stirring up thick clouds of steam that smelled of coarse ash and rendered tallow soap. The women working in the humid air of the laundry held a particular, unspoken power as they scrubbed the wet, heavy white linen with harsh lye that reddened their hands. They were the first to know the absolute truth of the queen's body. presence of blood on the sheets was a definitive marker of time, a biological clock that the entire kingdom was quietly tracking. Its arrival meant the failure of conception for another month, a plain physical fact that would be whispered from the wash house to the kitchens, moving up the back stairs until it reached the ears of the foreign ambassadors. Conversely, the sudden, prolonged absence of such evidence on the linen sheets signaled a profound change. It could mean the joyous anticipation of a legitimate heir, an event that would eventually be celebrated with ringing bells and the lighting of bonfires. Or, if the king had been away on a military campaign, or had been sleeping in a distant wing of the palace for many months, the clean sheets presented a terrifying problem. In those silent instances, the laundry maids knew to keep their eyes lowered as they stirred the boiling water in the copper vats, watching the steam rise into the cold morning air, fully aware that the pristine white fabric in their hands held secrets capable of toppling dynasties. When such secrets were finally brought into the light, the consequences were absolute, transforming lives of unimaginable luxury into existences defined by damp stone and silence. This was the reality that settled over Marguerite of Burgundy in the winter of 1314. Stripped of her silks and her status, her world had suddenly shrunk to the cold, unforgiving walls of Château-Gaillard, a fortress perched high above the River Seine. The transition from the warmth of the royal court to the freezing drafts of a stone cell was a physical shock as much as a political one. The affair of the Tour de Nesle, which had quietly shattered the French court, resulted in a swift and discreet removal. There were no public trials, only closed doors and whispered commands. Marguerite, the wife of the future King Louis X, found herself confined to a high tower. The heavy oak door of her chamber was bolted from the outside, leaving her to the biting chill that seeped through the ancient mortar. The walls of Château-Gaillard in winter wept with condensation, the moisture freezing into thin crusts of ice. By nightfall, she wore thick, unadorned wool, a stark departure from the ermine-lined velvet she had known, pulling it tightly around her shoulders as the wind howled through the narrow arrow slits. Her days were measured not by court ceremonies or the ringing of silver bells, but by the slow, rhythmic tread of boots on the narrow stone stairs outside her door. Twice a day, a guard would arrive to deliver her rations. food was a deliberate reflection of her fallen state. She was given dense, heavy brown bread, the kind baked for the garrison soldiers, often coarse with ash from the oven floor. Alongside, it came a wooden cup of watered wine, thin and sharp on the tongue, and a portion of heavily salted meat, usually pork or beef, preserved for the long winter months. The meat was tough, requiring slow, deliberate chewing, a simple physical task that helped to pass the endless hours of the afternoon. The salt from the meat would linger on her lips, a constant reminder of the austere reality of her confinement. The guards who brought these meals did not speak to her. They were instructed to look past her, to place the wooden trencher on a rough-hewn table, and to leave as quietly as they came. In this profound isolation, the sounds of the natural world became amplified. Marguerite would sit for hours by the narrow slit window, her breath pluming in the freezing air, listening to the relentless wind whipping off the river below. The Seine, which flowed calmly through the heart of Paris, where she had once reigned, here rushed coldly against the limestone cliffs, gray and indifferent to the woman locked in the tower above. As she watched the pale winter sun drag its short arc across the sky, tracing faint shadows on the uneven floorboards, the political machinery of France continued to turn without her. In the capital, her husband had ascended to the throne as Louis X. He was a king in desperate need of a male heir, and Marguerite, though imprisoned and disgraced, was still legally his wife. The church did not easily grant annulments, even for queens caught in the quiet, sordid scandals of the Tour de Nesle. Her continued breathing was a complication, a stubborn knot in the smooth fabric of the royal succession. She must have known, sitting in the drafty chill of her stone room, that her existence was an inconvenience being discussed in the warm, tapestried chambers of the Louvre. The winter wore on, each day identical to the last. The dense bread, the watered wine, the freezing stone, the hollow sound of the wind. The routine was designed not just to punish, but to erase. By removing her from the sight of the court, the crown hoped to remove her from memory, turning a living, breathing woman into a ghost long before her heart stopped beating. She would spend her final months in this suspended state, caught between the memory of her indiscretions and the quiet, inevitable approach of her own fading. Her world was reduced entirely to the heavy textures of rough wool, the taste of salt, and the cold gray light filtering through a crack in the ancient stone. While one woman might find herself permanently exiled to such a cold stone room, the rest of the court continued its quiet, dangerous rhythms for those still navigating the treacherous waters of royal favor. The survival of an illicit affair or a hidden pregnancy often depended on the simple, perilous act of putting a thought to parchment. The mechanics of secret correspondence required immense patience and a mastery of stealth. It began not with the writing itself, but with the quiet, careful brewing of ink to avoid drawing from the royal stationery supplies, where a sudden depletion might be noticed by the master of the household. A queen's trusted ladies would manufacture their own supplies in secret. They relied on a standard recipe for iron gall ink, but mixed it in fractions. They gathered oak galls, small, hard, round growths, collected from oak trees where wasps had laid their eggs. These were crushed into a fine, bitter-smelling powder. In the privacy of the bedchamber, this powder was mixed with iron sulfate, often called green vitriol, and a binder of gum arabic. The ladies would steep this mixture in rainwater or a splash of stale wine. The resulting liquid smelled faintly metallic and sour. This ink was not kept in an ornate silver or glass inkwell that sat openly on a writing desk. Instead, it was stored in small, unassuming ceramic pots, the kind usually holding medicinal salves or cosmetic pigments, easily pushed behind a stack of linen or concealed beneath a loose floorboard. The parchment, too, had to be sourced quietly. Offcuts of vellum, perhaps trimmed from the uneven edges of a larger, legitimate household ledger by a sympathetic clerk, served the purpose. Writing in a hurried, cramped hand by the dim light of a tallow candle, a queen or her lady would draft a message. The physical act of recording a treasonous sentiment, an arrangement for a midnight meeting, or the desperate admission of a missed monthly bleeding, required remarkably steady hands. Once the ink dried, turning a deep, indelible black as it oxidized against the scraped animal skin, the parchment had to be secured. A royal woman could not simply hand an open page to a courier, nor could she trust a standard fold. Instead, she employed intricate, deliberate folding techniques to turn the piece of parchment into its own tamper-proof envelope, a practice known as letterlocking. The parchment was scored and folded into a small, tight, geometric packet, often a triangle or a narrow rectangle. A thin, separate slice of parchment. A lock was cut from the edge of the page. Using the tip of a small knife, the sender would pierce a slit through all the folded layers of the letter. The locking strip was threaded through this hole, pulled taut, and wrapped tightly around the folded packet. To finalize the lock, a seal was required. The heavy golden signet rings bearing the royal crest were useless for this work. Pressing the queen's arms into wax would immediately identify the sender and doom all involved. Instead, the parchment lock was secured with a single drop of plain, uncolored beeswax. The natural wax was melted over a candle flame, dripped onto the interlocking paper, and pressed flat with a smooth stone or a blank coin. If a spy, a guard, or a suspicious king tried to unfold and read the contents, the paper lock would tear, or the brittle wax would crack, leaving undeniable, permanent evidence of the intrusion. Now reduced to a small, dense square of sealed vellum, the letter had to move out of the heavily guarded chambers. This required the complicity of the ladies-in-waiting, women who moved like shadows through the stone corridors, carrying linens, carrying water, carrying secrets. They developed ingenious, silent methods of transport, relying on the mundane objects of a woman's daily routine. A small, tightly locked note might be slipped inside the hollowed-out handle of a wooden hand mirror. The wooden cap would be set back in place, perhaps secured with a tiny dab of pine resin. To a passing guard, it was merely a lady carrying her mistresses, looking glass to another room for better light. During the colder months, the heavy garments worn to ward off the chill of the drafty castle offered even deeper hiding places. A trusted maid sitting by the hearth might carefully unpick an inch of stitching at the hem of a heavy velvet winter cloak. The small, wax-sealed letter would be slid deep between the thick, rough wool lining and the soft velvet exterior. A few quick, practiced stitches in the dim light would close the seam, swallowing the secret hole. The cloak would then be worn, the weight of the hidden parchment pressing gently against the calves or ankles of the courier as she walked. The heavy rustle of the velvet perfectly masked the faint, stiff crackle of the vellum. It was a slow, deliberate system, relying entirely on the unremarkable textures of domestic life to facilitate the most dangerous of liaisons, carrying words that could alter the bloodlines of a kingdom within the seams of a winter coat. When such clandestine networks failed, or when the political tides shifted violently against a royal woman, the consequences were rarely as abrupt as a public trial or an execution. For a queen whose transgressions had become too large to ignore, the punishment for scandal was more often a quiet, methodical erasure from public life. After the sudden fall and execution of her lover, Roger Mortimer, Queen Isabella of France was not imprisoned in a dungeon by her son, the young Edward Roman III. Instead, she was simply packed away, her vast political influence dissolved into the damp air of the English countryside. Her forced retirement began with a slow journey eastward in the late autumn of 1330. She was transferred to Castle Rising in Norfolk, traveling in a heavy wooden carriage suspended on thick leather straps. The iron-rimmed wheels sank deeply into the churning, freezing mud of the autumn roads, pulling with a thick, sucking sound at every rotation. It was a slow, lurching progression through a gray landscape. The damp chill of the season seeped through the timber of the carriage walls, carrying the scent of wet wool, decaying leaves, and the distant, sharp smoke of hearth fires from passing villages. She traveled with a strictly reduced retinue, a quiet procession moving steadily into the flat, marshy expanse of East Anglia, stripped of the grand fanfare that had once defined her movements across Europe. Castle Rising itself was a sturdy, imposing Norman keep surrounded by massive earthworks. It was comfortable, equipped with grand fireplaces and deep window seats, but it was unmistakably a gilded cage. The wind blowing in off the wash brought a constant, biting dampness to the stone walls, a physical reminder of her isolation from the warm, crowded, and dangerous corridors of the royal court. The transition from the chaotic, passionate heights of her regency to the sudden, echoing quiet of this provincial fortress was absolute. We know the exact texture of her confinement because of the meticulous household inventories that survive in the royal archives. The clerks recorded everything, reducing a life of international scandal and rebellion to a precise ledger of approved possessions. These documents list the heavy woolen blankets provided to ward off the Norfolk chill, dyed in muted shades of madder red and woad blue, folded and catalogue the embroidered cushions, stitched with heraldic beasts and trailing vines, placed carefully on the stone benches where she might sit and watch the flat, unbroken horizon. The inventories also detail the mundane necessities of her aristocratic upkeep. There are ledgers accounting for silver spoons stamped with maker's marks, heavy pewter plates for the servants, and the specific daily allowances of Gascon wine and spiced ale. She was maintained in a state of muted luxury that befitted a king's mother. Yet every item, every log of firewood, and every yard of linen was weighed and accounted for by the crown. The clerks even noted the regular purchase of small culinary luxuries, like imported cloves, mace, and cinnamon, which scented the roasting meats in the castle kitchens, offering a faint, aromatic reminder of the wider world she was no longer permitted to shape. The rhythm of her remaining decades settled into a deep, unbroken repetition. The days at Castle Rising were defined not by statecraft or shifting alliances, but by the slow, predictable turning of the liturgical hours. Her mornings began early in the small private chapel, kneeling on a padded velvet cushion for Mass. The low, murmuring Latin of her personal chaplain blended with the sweet, heavy scent of beeswax candles and the damp, chalky smell of the plaster walls. After Mass, the long afternoons were filled with quiet, solitary chores. She spent time in the castle mews, attending to the feeding of the hunting birds. The sharp, metallic scent of raw meat filled the cold air as she offered scraps to the falcons, wearing a thick leather gauntlet over her hand. The only sounds were the soft, sudden rustle of their feathers and the faint jingle of their tiny brass bells. A lingering, tactile connection to the noble pursuits of her youth, condensed entirely into a small, walled courtyard. As the early evening set in, the Norfolk sky darkening to a deep, bruised purple by mid-afternoon in the winter, she would retreat to her private chambers. The great fireplaces were kept well fed, with seasoned oak and ash snapping quietly in the hearth. She would sit by the fire, the heat pressing against her face, reading slowly from illuminated devotional books. The heavy vellum pages turned with a dull scrape, the lapis lazuli and gold leaf catching the flickering firelight. It was a life of profound, enforced tranquility, stretching on for nearly 30 years, until the memory of her scandalous reign simply faded into the quiet, rhythmic hum of a perfectly managed household. Across the channel, in a different century, another scandal was resolved, not with long decades of quiet confinement, but with a swift, administrative precision that left a very different sort of paper trail. The sudden fall of Queen Anne Boleyn in the spring of 1536 is recorded in the archives of the Tower of London, not as a tragedy, but simply as a matter of careful household expense. Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, kept meticulous ledgers during the roughly 2 weeks the Queen was in his custody. Even in disgrace, she was technically still the anointed queen, and her standard of living had to reflect the dignity of the crown, if only for the sake of strict bureaucratic protocol. The constable's accounts detail the precise cost of her daily meals, recorded in neat, looping script on heavy, rough-edged paper. The scratch of the clerk's quill documented a routine of continued comfort. The ledgers show regular daily deliveries of fine white manchet bread, small beer, and imported Gascon wine. For dinner and supper, the Tower kitchens provided roast beef, mutton, and capons, heavily seasoned with costly spices like cloves, mace, and ginger. The royal treasury disbursed exactly £15 for her diet during her brief imprisonment, a significant sum that ensured her table was set with heavy silver plates and fine linen. We can imagine the quiet clatter of silver spoons against trencher plates, the rich, savory smell of roasted meat mingling with the damp, mineral scent of the ancient stone walls. The Queen and her attending ladies ate their meals in a state of suspended animation, observing the polite table manners of the court while they waited. The vast bureaucracy of the Tudor state ground on, calculating the cost of her poultry down to the halfpenny, even as the carpenters outside in the courtyard measured the timber for her scaffold. When the time came for the sentence to be carried out, the exact same meticulous accounting applied to the instrument of her death. Beheading by the axe was a clumsy, uncertain method, and so a specialized craftsman was requisitioned. A master swordsman was summoned from Saint-Omer near Calais to make the journey across the channel. The treasury records note his payment with total clinical detachment. He was paid the considerable sum of £23, 6 shillings, and 8 pence for his services, along with his travel expenses. This fee was paid out in standard silver groats, pulled from the heavy oak and iron chests of the royal exchequer. The groat was a thick silver coin, slightly rough around the edges, bearing the profile of the king. It would have taken a clerk a long time to count out 23 pounds in groats. The metal would clink softly as it was stacked in neat piles on a wooden counting board, pushed across the green wool cloth by the clerk's ink-stained fingers. The swordsman received his heavy leather pouch of silver, completed his single, precise task on the morning of May 19th, and then quietly returned to the docks to catch a ship back to the continent. The transaction was complete, the ledger balanced, and the silver dispersed into the taverns and markets of northern France before the afternoon sun had even begun to set on the day of her death. The practical machinery of the royal household was already moving to absorb her absence. A queen's wardrobe was an asset of immense value, representing thousands of hours of skilled labor and vast sums of imported materials. It could not simply be discarded or locked away. In the Queen's chambers, her surviving ladies-in-waiting, moving in quiet, practiced routines, began the slow process of packing away her clothing. Heavy velvet gowns in deep shades of murrey, tawny, and black were carefully brushed out and folded. Silk sleeves, stiff with embroidery and heavy with seed pearls, were unpinned from their bodices and wrapped in undyed linen to protect the delicate metallic threads. The iconic French hoods, wired and edged with gold filaments, were nested smoothly together. These rich textiles were laid gently into large cedar chests, the wood naturally repelling the damp and the moths, filling the stone room with a sharp, dry, resinous scent. There was no room for sentimentality in the management of the royal stores. Within days, these heavy cedar chests were transported to the wardrobe of the robes. Here, tailors with sharp iron shears would begin the work of unpicking the seams. The yards of crimson velvet and cloth of gold would be cut down, repieced, and repurposed. Some garments would be altered to fit the new queen, Jane Seymour, who would quietly wear the silk and velvet that had only weeks before belonged to her predecessor. Other fabrics would be dyed darker or cut into cushion covers and heavy bed hangings. The physical traces of the scandalous queen slowly dismantled and woven back into the everyday fabric of the palace. The physical fabric of the Tudor court was intimately maintained and observed by a very specific group of women. The attendants who served the queen, known as the ladies of the bedchamber, existed in a state of intense, constant physical proximity to their mistress. They were not merely employees who arrived in the morning and departed at dusk. Their lives were entirely bound to the small, interconnected sequence of rooms that made up the queen's private apartments. They spent the vast majority of their days and nights within those heavy oak doors, forming a secluded world that operated on its own quiet rhythms, far removed from the public pageantry of the great hall. These inner chambers were deliberately kept small to conserve heat, their walls lined with thick wool and silk tapestries that absorbed the chill of the stone and muffled the sounds of the outside palace. Great fires burned continuously in the hearths, even in the milder months, making the rooms notoriously overheated and close. The air was heavy, carrying the constant, clinging scent of wood smoke mingling with the sharp, clean fragrance of lavender water, which the women used frequently to wash their hands and faces. Rose water and crushed cloves were sometimes scattered on the rush-matted floors to sweeten the stagnant air of spaces that were densely crowded with bodies, heavy carved furniture, and the rustle of stiff, embroidered fabrics. When night fell, this physical proximity only deepened. There was no privacy in the modern sense, not even for the queen. As the heavy velvet curtains of the royal bed were drawn shut, her attendants did not leave the room to find their own quarters. Instead, they slept exactly where they worked. Low trundle pallets, simple wooden frames strung with tight rope, and topped with thin feather mattresses, were pulled out from beneath the queen's great bed or arranged neatly at its foot. The ladies would lie down together in the dim, flickering glow of a single banked fire, wrapped in wool blankets, listening to the breathing of their monarch just a few feet away. If the queen woke in the dark, she had only to speak a word, and a lady would rise from the floor to offer a cup of watered wine or adjust a slipping blanket. This nocturnal closeness meant that the ladies of the bedchamber knew the physical realities of the queen's body better than any physician. They knew the rhythms of her sleep, the nights she paced the floor in silent distress, the arrival of her monthly courses, and the subtle, early signs of a desired pregnancy. They washed her intimate linens, brushed the wood smoke from her hair, and laced her into her rigid garments each morning. Because they were always present, these women were also the silent, constant witnesses to the shifting currents of power and scandal. The Queen's apartments were a sequence of chambers, moving from the more public outer presence chamber to the deeply private bedchamber. The ladies of the bedchamber controlled access to those inner sanctuaries, sitting for hours with their embroidery in the deep embrasures of the stone windows, making use of the fading afternoon daylight. They engaged in the quiet observation of exactly who entered and left the outer rooms. They noted which foreign ambassadors were granted a private audience, which noblemen lingered a little too long near the doorway, and which of their own number was suddenly wearing a jewel they could not possibly afford. In the dim light of those window seats, to the steady rhythm of pulling silk thread through tight linen, this knowledge was slowly and carefully traded. A whispered comment about a delayed letter, a softly spoken observation about a secret visitor brought up the back stairs. These fragments of information were the true currency of the court, exchanged without ever looking up from their needles when affairs began, or when a quiet disappearance was being arranged. It was the ladies of the bedchamber who saw the initial, unpolished mechanics of the scandal. They were the ones tasked with looking away at the correct moment, or ensuring a heavy oak door was left unbolted. They held the dangerous responsibility of carrying concealed messages tucked into the deep sleeves of their gowns, moving through the overheated corridors with the calm, practiced expressions of women who knew that their own survival depended on keeping the secrets of the bedchamber locked safely behind their quiet eyes. When such secrets could no longer be contained, or when a woman's very existence became an insurmountable political obstacle, the solution was rarely sudden violence. It was, rather, a slow vanishing, a quiet carriage ride into the deep interior of the country. For a queen whose mind was declared unfit, or whose continued presence threatened the careful architecture of a dynasty's succession, the world simply shrank to the dimensions of a single house. In the early months of 1509, Juana of Castile made exactly such a journey, traveling across the dry, sweeping plains of central Spain. Her royal retinue moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a funeral procession, destination was Tordesillas, a palace that sat high on a bluff, overlooking the slow-moving waters of the Douro River. It was a complex of high brick walls and small, shaded courtyards, designed less for the comforts of a monarch than for absolute, impenetrable isolation. The journey took days over rough, dusty roads. The heavy wooden wheels of the carriage grinding against the earth, carrying the queen further and further from the center of power. When the heavy wooden gates of Tordesillas closed behind her, they would not open for her again for 46 years. The palace was an austere, imposing structure attached to the royal convent of Santa Clara. The architecture itself spoke of containment. Thick stone walls absorbed the intense heat of the Castilian summers and held fast to the bitter cold of the winter months. The windows were narrow, letting in only thin shafts of light that moved slowly across the glazed tile floors as the days bled into weeks and the weeks into decades. The air inside her apartments was heavy and still. It smelled perpetually of melting beeswax candles, the sharp smoke of the wicks mingling with the damp, mineral scent of old stone. There was a profound quietness to the rooms, a muffled quality created by thick tapestries hung to block the drafts. Her world was reduced to a few chambers, a handful of watchful servants, and the endless, repeating rhythm of the days. The vibrant courts she had known in her youth were replaced by the scraping of a wooden chair against the floor, the rustle of heavy wool, and the soft footsteps of her guards in the corridor outside. This strict daily routine was structured entirely around the divine office, a relentless schedule of prayer that marked the passing hours. Juana's primary connection to the world beyond her rooms was the adjoining convent. To attend Mass, she did not step out into the grand nave among the congregation. Instead, she stood in a private, elevated gallery, separated from the cloistered nuns below by a thick, iron-studded wooden grille. Through the small gaps in the carved wood and cold metal, she could smell the heavy drift of frankincense and hear the low, rhythmic chanting of the sisters. The chanting rose up from the chapel, echoing off the vaulted ceilings, regular and hypnotic. This sound became the defining measure of her life. Matins in the dark, early hours, lauds at dawn, vespers as the light finally faded. The heavy grille kept her invisible, a phantom queen listening in the shadows. The iron studs were cold to the touch. The the wood polished smooth by years of hands resting against it. Her confinement was a strange sort of living death, orchestrated first by her father and later maintained without interruption by her own son. There were no dramatic confrontations, no chains in dark dungeons. Her captivity was entirely domestic, dressed in the trappings of royal care and spiritual retreat. She was provided with fine clothes, which she often replaced with coarse, simple garments, and given rich food she frequently refused to eat. The profound scandal of her existence, a legitimate reigning queen whose authority had to be usurped so the men in her family could rule, was buried neatly under the guise of medical and spiritual necessity. The servants who attended her moved carefully through the rooms, speaking in low, modulated tones. They brought in heavy brass braziers of burning charcoal during the winter months. The faint smell of ash adding to the stale air of the chambers. They swept the small courtyards where she was sometimes permitted to walk. The dry leaves of the olive trees scratching lightly against the paving stones. It was a life defined entirely by its boundaries and by the slow, steady drip of time in a house where the doors were always locked from the outside. Beyond those locked doors, the landscape of Castile underwent its quiet, inevitable transformations. From the narrow windows of her confinement, the changing of the seasons offered the only reliable measure of passing years. The Spanish summers arrived with a baking, relentless heat that turned the surrounding plains the color of pale straw. The sky bleached to a hazy white by midday, and the heavy air in her chambers grew stifling, smelling faintly of hot dust and dry timber. Outside, the cicadas hummed their steady drone, a sound that vibrated through the thick stone walls of the palace. Then the heat would gradually break, giving way to the autumn winds that swept across the plateau. The dry dust turned to mud, and the skies darkened with heavy, low-hanging clouds. Winter in Tordesillas was a bitter, damp affair. Rain lashed against the leaded glass, and the cold seeped upward through the floorboards and the stone flags, settling deep into the bones of the building. Frost rimed the edges of the window panes in the early mornings, and the once bright landscape dissolved into a muted palette of gray skies and dark, wet earth. This cycle of baking heat and biting cold repeated itself without variation, turning a handful of years into a decade, and then into several. As the years wore on, the physical realities of her daily life adapted to the harshness of this environment. When she had first arrived at Tortosilla's, her trunks still held the garments of a reigning monarch. There were heavy silks dyed in deep crimson, bodices embroidered with gold thread, and fine linen shifts edged with delicate Flemish lace. But silk offers little comfort against the deep, damp chill of an unheated stone floor in January, and velvet grows heavy and stiff when the air is thick with winter moisture. Over time, these remnants of court life began to fray and fade, their bright dyes dulling in the dim light of her rooms. Slowly, the contents of her wardrobe changed. The silk and velvet were packed away, or simply worn to rags, replaced by garments chosen entirely for their utility. She spent her later years swathed in coarse, heavy woolens, spun thick, and dyed in dark, unforgiving shades of black or brown. These woolen gowns were practical, designed to hold off the drafts that slipped beneath the doors. They smelled faintly of lanolin and wood smoke, a dense, earthy scent that clung to the heavy fabric. On the coldest days, she wore layers of these dark garments, the rough textures rubbing against the plainer linens beneath. Her silhouette lost the structured elegance of a courtly figure, taking on the padded, heavy shape of an ordinary woman simply trying to stay warm. The details of this quiet existence were meticulously documented, not in royal chronicles, but in the mundane financial ledgers kept by her wardens. The men tasked with guarding her maintained strict accounts of every coin spent on her household. These ledgers survive as a strangely intimate record of a life lived entirely out of sight. The pages are filled with lists of basic necessities, written out in the careful, looping script of clerks who tallied the cost of keeping a hidden woman alive. They recorded the frequent purchases of firewood, noting the cords of oak and pine stacked in the courtyards to feed the small hearths in her rooms. There are entries for the delivery of plain, unbleached linen bought by the yard to replace worn bedsheets and undergarments. The food accounts show a diet that gradually shifted away from the spiced meats and sugared delicacies of the palace. Instead, the ledgers list bulk purchases of root vegetables, sacks of turnips, carrots, and onions, along with dried beans, salted fish, and coarse bread. It was the simple, sturdy fare of a rural household, nourishing but entirely uncelebrated. In these ledgers, the reality of her daily life was reduced to simple arithmetic. She was, by law, the sovereign owner of the lands stretching out beyond her window. Yet her daily existence was measured by the price of a bushel of onions or a yard of rough cloth. Her wardens managed these expenses with clinical precision, ensuring she was fed, clothed, and warmed just enough to sustain her. To the outside world, she had practically ceased to exist, a shadow in the political machinery of Europe. But to the clerks updating the household accounts, she was simply an ongoing expense, a column of numbers that required tending month after month, year after year, as the seasons turned endlessly outside her window. In France, the view from such a window often looked out over the deep, quiet expanses of the provincial countryside, far from the bustling courtyards of Paris and Versailles. The crown maintained a network of remote shadows, quiet estates built of pale limestone with steep slate roofs that vanished into the gray winter sky. These isolated manor houses served a highly specific purpose in the royal ecosystem. They were the designated repositories for the discarded and the inconvenient. A royal mistress who had aged out of favor, a cousin whose political alliances had become troublesome, or an illegitimate daughter whose presence complicated a delicate marriage negotiation, could simply be packed into a carriage in the dead of night and sent to the provinces. Once there, the woman was provided with a household staff, a modest allowance, and absolute isolation. The guards at the gates were dressed in the livery of servants, but their function was dual. They poured the wine and tended the fires, and they also ensured that the lady of the house did not leave, and that unauthorized letters did not find their way into the hands of passing merchants. The daily reality of this exile was built on a foundation of profound silence. The air in these old stone houses smelled of wood smoke, old wool, and the dried lavender used to keep moths from the linens. To occupy the vast, empty expanses of time that stretched before a woman in such a position, the crown often funded the planting of formal, geometric gardens. These were not the wild, rambling landscapes of later centuries, but rigid exercises in control and symmetry. armies of local laborers were hired to dig out the earth, laying down deep beds of gravel and planting hundreds of young boxwood shrubs. Over the years, under the careful shears of the gardeners, these shrubs grew into high, dense hedges, forming intricate knot patterns and long, straight walkways that intersected at perfect right angles. The purpose of these gardens was largely psychological. They provided a contained, orderly world where an exiled woman could take the air without ever breaching the perimeter of her confinement. The high boxwood walls blocked the view of the open roads and the rolling hills beyond the estate, focusing the eye entirely on the internal geometry of the garden itself. In the damp chill of a provincial morning, the clipped boxwood gave off a sharp, green, slightly bitter scent. A woman might spend 2 or 3 hours a day simply walking these gravel paths, her heavy silk skirts dragging softly over the small stones, pacing the exact same geometric loops she had walked the day before and the year before that. When the dampness of the garden grew too cold, the rhythm of the day moved indoors, governed by the slow ticking of a tall case clock in the hall. After a quiet, solitary meal served on heavy silver plates, the afternoon was traditionally given over to the embroidery frame. This was not a small wooden hoop held in the lap, but a large, heavy piece of furniture made of polished walnut, designed to hold a wide expanse of linen canvas, completely taut. Embroidery was considered the ideal occupation for a woman of high birth in forced retirement. It required no physical exertion. It kept the hands busy, and it demanded just enough concentration to keep the mind from wandering too far into dangerous, melancholy territories. She would sit on a low stool, a basket of dyed silk threads at her side. The work was incredibly slow. The needle would pierce the tight linen with a soft, distinct pop, followed by the quiet friction of the silk thread being pulled through the fabric. Down, through, pull. Up, through, pull. As the hours stretched on, the sunlight in the sitting room would slowly shift across the wide oak floorboards, crawling up the faded tapestries on the walls. The fine work required excellent light, and as the afternoon waned into early evening, the colors of the silk, the deep crimsons, the pale golds, the rich indigo blues, began to blur together in the shadows. The woman would lean closer to the tight canvas, her eyes straining in the dimming light, continuing to pull the thread through the fabric until a servant quietly entered the room to light the beeswax candles, bringing the sharp, sweet smell of warm wax into the cold stone room, signaling the end of another perfectly ordered, entirely empty day. When that empty order was threatened by the sudden, quiet realization of a missed cycle, the solution could not be found within the palace walls. The royal physicians were men of science, but they were also men of the court, their loyalties tied to the king and the preservation of the official bloodline. A complication of this nature, an unexpected child growing in the womb of a queen or a favored lady, fathered in the shadows of a neglected marriage, required a different sort of medicine. It required the quiet, unregulated trade that flourished far from the gilded gates, thriving in the narrow, damp back streets of 17th century Paris. To procure such a remedy, a trusted maid or a discreet intermediary would have to leave the palace grounds, slipping out into the dense fog that often settled over the city near the river. They would walk over uneven, muddy cobblestones, navigating labyrinthine alleys where the overhanging eaves of the timber-framed houses nearly touched overhead, perpetually blocking out the sun. The destination was usually a small, unassuming shop, marked only by a painted wooden mortar and pestle hanging above a heavy oak door. The air inside these apothecary shops was thick and still, heavy with a complex medicinal dust that settled onto the floorboards and the glass panes. Inside, the walls were lined from floor to ceiling with rough-hewn wooden shelves, sagging slightly under the weight of hundreds of small glass vials, unglazed ceramic jars, and locking wooden boxes. The smells were sharp and earthy, a dense tapestry of organic matter curing in the shadows. There was the deep, root-like scent of dried belladonna, the sweet, anise-heavy aroma of crushed fennel, and the faint, bitter metallic tang of ground antimony. Bunches of pennyroyal, rue, and mugwort hung upside down from the low wooden rafters, their leaves crisping and curling as they dried, brushing lightly against the hats of the customers who stepped up to the counter. The apothecary did not ask questions. He was a merchant of practical chemistry, mixing face powders of white lead for the court, blending perfumes of ambergris and musk, and, when the right sum was offered, providing tinctures for more private matters. The conversation would be brief, couched in the polite medical terminology of the era, a quiet request would be made for a purgative, something to clear a stubborn internal obstruction, or a strong draft to restore a woman's natural courses. Heavy silver coins would be placed softly on the scratched surface of the counter, and in return, a small glass vial of dark liquid or a folded paper of pale powder would be passed across the wood. Once the vial made its journey back to the palace, hidden deep within the inner pockets of a heavy woolen cloak, it was brought into the private bedchamber. The administration of the remedy was a clinical, deliberate procedure. It usually took place in the late evening, when the day's obligations were finished and the ladies-in-waiting had been dismissed for the night. The woman would sit alone by the hearth, the low firelight catching the faceted glass of a goblet filled with dark red wine. The vial was unstoppered. The potion inside was often thick, smelling strongly of bitter roots and high-proof alcohol. Holding the small glass over the wine, she would carefully measure the specific drops, watching them fall one by one, dissolving into the dark liquid. It was a precise, quiet mathematics passed down through whispers and old, guarded manuscripts. 3 drops, perhaps 5, depending on the apothecaries' strict instructions. Too little would do nothing. Too much would invite the coroner. The wine, heavily spiced with cinnamon, cloves, and honey, served to mask the sharp, astringent taste of the abortifacient herbs and the heavy metals. She would drink the wine slowly, feeling the warmth of the alcohol and the ambient heat of the fire on her skin. Then the waiting would begin. By morning, or perhaps by the following night, the body would respond to the crushed herbs and the toxic powders. There would be a sudden feverish warmth, a gripping ache in the lower abdomen, a heavy, dark bleeding that would soak into the linen sheets. To the rest of the household, it was simply a fleeting illness, a natural imbalance of the humors brought on by damp night air or rich food. The royal physician might be called to prescribe bed rest and light broths. The soiled linens would be gathered by the maids, soaked in large wooden vats of cold water, and scrubbed with harsh lye soap until they were white again. The complication was washed away. The threat to the royal succession quietly dissolved into the wash water, leaving the palace to resume its perfectly ordered, entirely uninterrupted routines. But when the complications could not be handled entirely within the bedchamber, A broader network was required to supply the means of resolution. By the late 17th century, specifically in the Paris of 1679, the demand for quiet solutions to inconvenient problems had fostered a thriving shadow economy of midwives, alchemists, and fortune tellers. The royal court at Versailles, with its strict hierarchies and fierce competitions for favor, relied heavily on these discreet practitioners. They provided powders to encourage love, potions to hasten an inheritance, and drafts to ensure a pregnancy never came to term. It was a trade built entirely on whispers, enacted in the narrow, soot-stained alleys of the city, far from the gilded mirrors and polished parquet floors of the palace. Yet whispers eventually accumulate into records. When the Parisian authorities began to uncover the sheer scale of this illicit commerce, they approached the matter not with panic, but with the methodical precision of clerks. The resulting investigation generated mountains of paperwork in the dimly lit offices of the police lieutenants. Thick, leather-bound ledgers were stacked high on heavy wooden desks. Scribes dipped their quills into iron gall ink, carefully noting down names, dates, and transactions, creating a systematic, heavily cross-referenced network of files. A single arrest of a neighborhood apothecary might yield a ledger containing dozens of aristocratic names, each entry detailing the purchase of a specific powder or the arrangement of a particular clandestine service. The steady scratching of the pens filled the quiet rooms, translating whispered palace secrets into cold, bureaucratic evidence. As the names in the leather-bound files grew more prominent, the carriages of the authorities began to arrive at the grand estates of the nobility in the dead of night. Those implicated were quietly escorted away from their woven tapestries and heavy feather beds, taken instead to the holding cells of the Vincennes fortress. It was a stark transition. The cells at Vincennes were cold and damp, smelling of ancient stone, wet earth, and stagnant moat water. Women who were accustomed to the daily scent of rosewater and the warmth of massive hearths found themselves sitting in the gloom on thin, prickly straw mattresses. They waited there in the chill, listening to the echoing footsteps of the guards in the stone corridors, anticipating the arrival of the magistrates who would question them about their visits to the fortune tellers and their purchases of strange, unmarked vials. The magistrates worked slowly, moving from cell to cell with their parchment and ink, recording testimonies that wove an ever-tightening net around the upper echelons of society. The accused women passed the hours in the dim light of narrow slit windows, wrapped in their heavy wool and velvet cloaks to ward off the biting damp of the fortress walls. Meals were brought in simple wooden bowls, coarse bread, and thin root stews that offered little comfort against the cold. The contrast between the rigid, luxurious etiquette of the court and the stark reality of the prison was absolute. Yet, even in the damp cells of Vincennes, a certain hierarchy remained, as the authorities carefully calculated exactly how far up the social ladder the accusations could be allowed to reach. When the cross-referenced files finally pointed too close to the king's immediate circle, the nature of the justice system shifted. The public trials and executions were reserved for the apothecaries and the street-level practitioners, for the high-ranking noblewomen whose public ruin would cast a shadow over the crown itself. A different protocol was observed. The king issued private orders, sealed with heavy red wax, directing the discreet relocation of these women. In the early hours of the morning, unmarked carriages would carry them away from the holding cells, bound for distant country convents. These were quiet, isolated stone structures, surrounded by high walls and thick forests. The heavy wooden gates would open to receive the newly exiled noblewoman, and then close firmly behind her, shutting away the scandal before it could fully break. Inside the convent walls, the women would spend the rest of their lives in forced prayer and quiet routine, wearing plain wool habits and eating the simple vegetable pottage prepared by the nuns. Their names slowly faded from the ledgers of the court, while the palace carried on its grand ceremonies as if they had never existed at all. This same quiet method of erasure was practiced by the House of Hanover, though they favored the isolation of the northern marshes over the cloister. In the winter of 1694, a heavy wooden carriage jolted its way across the flat, damp landscapes of northern Germany. Inside sat Sophia Dorothea of Celle, who until very recently had been the electoral princess of Hanover. The journey was long and physically punishing. The roads through the marshlands were deeply rutted from the autumn rains, causing the leather suspension of the carriage to groan and sway with every mile. Outside outside the small glass windows, the scenery offered nothing but a bleak expanse of gray skies, frost-hardened mud, and the distant, skeletal silhouettes of dormant willow trees. The damp chill of the marshes seeped through the floorboards, mingling with the heavy scent of wet wool, horse sweat, and the faint, metallic smell of the oil lanterns swinging softly outside. Her destination was the castle of Alden, a modest fortification situated on the River Aller. It was not a palace built for grand entertainments, but a remote and functional structure surrounded by a slow-moving moat and vast tracts of featureless heath. When the carriage finally rolled to a halt, it was within a courtyard enclosed by thick stone walls. Here, the physical reality of her new life was established with the closing of heavy oak doors and the turning of iron locks. The castle was strictly divided. Sophia Dorothea was permitted a small household of loyal servants, individuals who managed her daily needs, maintaining a quiet, domestic rhythm within her designated chambers. Beyond those chambers, separated by thick timber and iron, stood a permanent detachment of guards. The soldiers patrolled the perimeter day and night, their heavy boots echoing on the cobblestones, a constant auditory reminder of the boundary between the princess's household and the world outside. The circumstances that brought her to this damp fortress were handled by the Hanoverian court with swift, clinical efficiency. For years, Sophia Dorothea had been involved in an affair with a Swedish count named Philip Christoph von Königsmark. The liaison ended abruptly when the count vanished inside the Lane Palace during a midnight visit to her chambers. Historical records suggest he was killed by courtiers loyal to her father-in-law. His body weighted with stones and dropped into the river, or perhaps buried beneath the palace floorboards. The court did not acknowledge a murder. Instead, they quickly finalized a divorce based entirely on the charge of her desertion. She was stripped of her titles, her property, and her right to remarry. At 28 years old, she was informed she would never see her two young children again. Life at Alden quickly settled into a rigid, unchanging routine, governed by strict regulations drafted by her former husband. She was allowed a certain standard of living, befitting a woman of high birth who was officially a prisoner of state. Her rooms were warmed by large tile stoves that smelled faintly of wood smoke and ash. Her meals were carefully prepared, featuring roasted fowl, root vegetables from the local soil, and dark bread, served on silver plates by servants who moved with quiet deference. Yet her physical movement was meticulously controlled. She was permitted to walk for fresh air, but only along a specific, short stretch of gravel in the castle's inner courtyard. Day after day, year after year, she paced this exact line of crushed stone. The sound of her leather shoes crunching against the gravel became the steady metronome of her exile. She would walk under the pale sun of the brief northern summers, and wrapped in heavy furs during the biting damp of the winter months, always watched by the sentries posted on the walls above. If she wished to ride in a carriage, she could do so only within a strictly defined perimeter around the castle, always accompanied by an armed escort, her route mapped out to ensure she never approached the main roads leading back to civilization. Inside her chambers, time stretched out in long hours of embroidery, reading, and letter writing. She wrote countless appeals to her parents and former allies, letters carefully folded and sealed with wax, most of which yielded nothing but polite, evasive replies or total silence. The heavy oak doors kept the world at bay, preserving her household in a strange amber of routine. While she sat by the fire, listening to the wind sweep off the marshlands, her former husband would go on to inherit the British throne, crossing the sea to become King George I. He would rule a vast, expanding empire from the palaces of London, while the woman who was once his wife remained walking her designated stretch of gravel, quietly fading from the memory of Europe behind the iron locks of Alden. Inside the walls of the castle, the years began to stretch out into an endless, quiet rhythm, recorded largely through the scratching of a quill. For a woman stripped of her title, her children, and her freedom, paper became the only remaining territory she could inhabit. Over the decades, Sophia Dorothea produced thousands of pages of correspondence, writing in dense, looping script that filled the margins of thick parchment. She wrote with black iron gall ink, a common mixture of crushed oak galls, iron sulfate, and gum arabic that flowed dark from the pen, smelling faintly of metal and damp earth, and bit deeply into the fibers of the paper. Over the centuries, this highly acidic ink would slowly burn its way through the pages. But in the quiet rooms of Alden, It was simply the medium of her daily routine. She wrote of the slow, heavy passage of time, with no court events to attend, no political maneuvers to observe, and no visitors from her previous life. The contents of her letters turned inward, focusing on the minute details of her confinement. She documented the unchanging landscape outside her designated window, describing the flat, damp marshlands where the reeds bent in the wind, the slow-moving waters of the River Aller, and the gray skies that seemed to press down on the roof of the estate. She noted the way the winter light fell across the wooden floorboards, shifting its angle slightly day by day, month by month, until the brief summers returned to warm the glass. Her letters were less a form of communication than a mechanism for survival, a way to mark the days so they did not blur entirely into one unbroken twilight. While she documented her internal life and the static horizon, another vast archive of paper was being generated just down the hall. The local governor, appointed to oversee her captivity and manage the estate, maintained a meticulous clinical record of her existence. His ledgers contained no reflections on the weather or the weight of isolation. Instead, they were filled with the precise cataloging of household expenses, reducing a royal life to a column of carefully tallied numbers. Every groschen spent on the maintenance of the prisoner, and her small, closely monitored retinue was recorded in neat, upright handwriting. These expense reports offer a highly textured map of daily life in the prison. The governor noted the exact cost of every beeswax candle required to illuminate her rooms during the long, dark Hanoverian winters, tracking how quickly they burned down to the nub. He recorded the daily delivery of bread, distinguishing between the coarse, dark rye baked for the guards and the finer, white wheat loaves brought to the prisoner's table. There were entries for the purchase of seasoned firewood, stacked by the cord in the inner courtyard, and the exact yardage of replacement linen ordered when her bedsheets and undergarments finally wore thin from years of washing. The ledgers track the purchase of sewing needles, riding sand, sealing wax, and the occasional luxury of sugar or citrus, creating a perfect, mundane inventory of a life held in suspension. As the ledgers filled and were filed away, the physical environment of Alden began to reflect the immense weight of the time passing within it. 32 years is a difficult span to comprehend when it is devoid of milestones. For Sophia Dorothea, time was not measured by the birth of grandchildren or the shifting of political alliances, but by the slow, inevitable degradation of the objects around her. The passage of 3 decades could be read in the fading of the armchair upholstery in her sitting room. The heavy silk damask, once bright and stiff, gradually softened under her weight. The intricate floral patterns muting into a dusty, indistinct gray in the afternoon sun. The fabric thinning at the armrests, where her hands rubbed against the grain day after day, year after year. Outside, the elements worked steadily on the perimeter of her world. The heavy iron gates of the courtyard, locked securely each night, slowly surrendered to the damp air of the marshes. The black paint flaked away in brittle shards, replaced by the rough, spreading bloom of orange rust. The stone steps leading down to the garden were a shallow depression in the center, shaped by the soft leather of her shoes. As she took her daily, mandated exercise, walking the exact same route through the enclosed yard. The gravel path where she paced was continually crushed to a finer dust, replaced and crushed again, inside and out. Alden was a study in slow erosion, captured in thousands of pages of iron gall ink and the endless columns of the governor's careful accounting, quietly archiving the decades while the rest of Europe moved on. Further east, the archiving of inconvenient royal women took a different, deeply institutionalized form. In the Tsardom of Russia, and later the Russian Empire, there was no need to build a specialized prison or draft complex legal justifications for a woman's permanent confinement. The structure already existed, waiting quietly in the sprawling network of Orthodox convents. For centuries, the standard, seamless solution for an unwanted wife, an overly ambitious sister, or a politically dangerous daughter was the veil. It was a civil death, recognized by church and state alike. This removal was finalized in a single, irreversible ceremony, where the forceful cutting of a woman's hair legally and spiritually severed her from the royal bloodline, placing her permanently outside the line of succession. The transition was swift and physically jarring. A woman who had spent her life swathed in the heavy sable furs and stiff, gold-threaded silk brocades of the Winter Palace was systematically stripped of her worldly garments. The pearls and heavy emeralds woven into her elaborate braids were removed, and the hair itself was shorn close to the scalp with cold iron shears. In place of the intricate, vibrant court dress, she was handed the monastic habit. This was a shapeless garment, of course, heavy black wool, designed to obscure the form and humble the wearer. The wool was unyielding, retaining the damp chill of the stone walls and scratching relentlessly against skin accustomed to fine linens. The physical weight of the fabric was a constant, tactile reminder of her new station. The hem dragging heavily along the rough floorboards as she walked the narrow, shadowed corridors. With the dawning of the black wool, her previous name was erased, replaced entirely by a newly assigned monastic one. A tsarina became a simple nun. Her royal identity dissolved into the collective, quiet anonymity of the sisterhood. The daily routine was grueling, structured to break the will through sheer repetition and physical exhaustion. The heavy iron bells rang in the freezing hours long before dawn, calling the women from their hard pallets to the first of many daily services. There was no allowance made for former rank or delicate upbringing. The disgraced royal woman stood in the same drafty chapels, knelt on the same freezing stone floors, and ate the same meager wooden bowls of thin cabbage soup, black bread, and buckwheat porridge as the peasant women who had taken vows beside her. The chapels themselves became the primary sensory anchors in this new, deeply restricted life. They were perpetually dimly lit. The narrow, deeply set windows, allowing only thin shafts of pale, silvery northern light to pierce the gloom. The air inside was always thick with a heavy, resinous scent of frankincense, layered over the distinct, sweet, and slightly dusty smell of melting beeswax. Hundreds of thin, yellow tapers burned before the towering iconostases, their small flames flickering in the drafts that swept through the stone archways. These tiny fires cast long, wavering shadows across the painted, gilded faces of the saints, making the static figures seem to breathe in the dark. The incense smoke settled in the wooden rafters and clung to the coarse wool of the nuns' habits, ensuring that the heavy smell of the church followed them back to their small, unheated cells. The auditory world shrank to a continuous loop of chanted prayers, and the soft shuffling of leather-soled shoes on worn stone. During the endless evening vigils, the hypnotic, low-pitched chanting of the liturgy filled the cavernous space, vibrating faintly in the chest and lulling the tired mind into a state of numbed endurance. The repetition of the Jesus prayer, murmured thousands of times a day, became a steady metronome, marking the slow, indistinguishable passage of hours and years. A former regent who had once commanded armies and received foreign ambassadors now spent her days passing a knotted woolen prayer rope through her calloused fingers, each knot representing a quiet plea in a world she would never leave. Though technically a spiritual retreat, the convent was heavily guarded when it housed a royal prisoner. Soldiers of the Tsar's guard often camped just outside the whitewashed convent walls, their distant voices and the clinking of their equipment a quiet reminder that this monastic confinement was enforced by the state. Letters were intercepted. Visitors were strictly forbidden. And even the abbess was carefully chosen for her unwavering loyalty to the current ruler. The disgraced woman might live for 3 or 4 decades in this suspended state, aging slowly in the shadow of the icons, her former life fading into a distant memory, buried quietly beneath the scent of wax and the heavy, scratchy drape of black wool. When the long Russian winter set in, that black wool became a vital necessity. The Novodevichy convent, with its thick, fortress-like walls and towering spires, was built to withstand sieges, but it offered little defense against the creeping, pervasive cold of December and January. The freezing temperatures seemed to radiate directly upward from the massive stone floors, moving through the soles of felt boots and settling deep into the bones of the women confined there. These were floors designed for asceticism, not comfort, and the polished stone held the frost with a stubborn resilience, remaining bitterly cold long after the pale, low winter sun had risen over the frozen Moskva River. The narrow windows of the cells allowed only a meager gray light to filter through, and on the coldest mornings, a thick layer of hoarfrost would form on the inside of the glass. The air in the unheated corridors was sharp enough to make a person's breath plume in thick white clouds, and the daily walk to the refectory or the main cathedral was a quiet endurance test for noblewomen who had grown up in palaces heated by massive, floor-to-ceiling masonry stoves decorated with painted tiles. Women who were accustomed to being surrounded by furs and heavy velvet draft excluders. The stark chill of the convent was a profound physical shock, a constant shivering reminder of their altered status. To stave off the worst of the cold, the confined women were provided with small charcoal braziers. These shallow metal pans, often made of beaten copper or heavy iron, were brought into the cells by lay sisters, carrying a carefully measured allotment of smoldering fuel. The braziers provided only a very modest circle of heat, barely enough to warm the immediate air. A disgraced Grand Duchess or a fallen royal favorite would sit as close to the brazier as her heavy skirts allowed, hovering her hands over the dull, red glow of the coals, just to return some feeling to her fingertips. The air in the small rooms would grow heavy with the dry, slightly metallic scent of burning charcoal and white ash, mingling with the ever-present smell of stale incense and old beeswax. It was over these small, glowing braziers that the women spent hours reading the devotional texts assigned to them. The daily routine of the convent demanded constant prayer and reflection, filling the long, dark hours of the winter afternoon. The heavy wooden boards of the books were bound in dark leather and secured with brass clasps that were biting cold to the touch. The thick paper pages grew stiff in the chill, and the women would turn them slowly with warmed hands, their lips moving silently over church Slavonic verses. The repetition of the words provided a rhythm to days that were otherwise entirely devoid of incident. The quiet rustle of the turning pages and the soft shifting of the charcoal settling in the pan, becoming the only sounds in the isolated cells. And while these women sat in the quiet, dim cold, warming their hands and tracing the lines of ancient prayers, their names were undergoing a systematic erasure hundreds of miles away in St. Petersburg. The process was not violent, nor was it announced with any grand proclamation. It was simply a gradual, quiet omission, a bureaucratic fading, orchestrated by the clerks and chamberlains of the imperial court. In the official court registers, where every noble presence, every allowance, and every ranking was meticulously recorded in flowing script, the disgraced woman's name was simply left out of the New Year's ledgers with the scratch of a quill and and the scattering of drying sand over wet ink. The line she had occupied was given to another. Her properties were quietly reabsorbed into the crown's holdings or redistributed to new favorites. The paperwork filed away with unremarkable efficiency. The seamstresses who had once noted her measurements for court gowns discarded their patterns. The jewelers who had maintained her diamonds struck her account from their books. In the realm of diplomacy, the erasure was equally thorough. Foreign ambassadors who had once carefully noted the woman's influence, her moods, and her alliances in their encrypted dispatches to Versailles, London, or Vienna, ceased to mention her. For a month or two, a cautious postscript might inquire about her whereabouts, noting a sudden absence from the winter balls. But soon, understanding the permanent nature of a banishment to Novodevichy, the diplomats adjusted. They turned their attention to the new powers at court, and the confined woman's name vanished entirely from the diplomatic correspondence, as if she had never existed at all, leaving her stranded in the endless, freezing silence of the convent winter. Far from the freezing winters of the East, a different sort of silence was settling over the damp, misty landscapes of Northern Europe. In the early spring of 1772, beneath a heavy gray sky, another quiet removal was taking place. Queen Caroline Matilda, sister to the British king and wife to the Danish one, was being escorted away from her life. The weather was characterized by a lingering, penetrating dampness that settled heavily into the dark wool cloaks of the armed guards riding alongside her carriage. The wooden wheels turned slowly, grinding through the soft, muddy roads of the countryside. There was no grand public declaration of her crimes. Her affair with the court physician, Johann Friedrich Struensee, and the birth of a daughter whose parentage was an open secret. There was only the steady, rhythmic sound of horses' hooves carrying a disgraced queen toward permanent exile. Her destination was Cell Castle, a sprawling, moated fortress in Hanover, offered by her brother as a secure place for her to disappear. The journey took days, moving steadily through the damp German fields. Fog hung low over the ground, obscuring the horizon and mirroring the sudden, sharp narrowing of her world. Inside the carriage, the air smelled of damp leather upholstery and the faint, earthy scent of wet horses and mud. When the heavy, iron-studded wooden doors of Cell Castle finally closed behind her, she was officially a ghost to the Danish court, stripped of her titles and separated forever from her two young children. She was 20 years old. Life within the thick stone walls of cell soon settled into a slow, deliberate rhythm, entirely removed from the political machinations and whispered scandals of Copenhagen. Her days were now her own, structured only by the passing of the sun and the chiming of the castle clocks. In the quiet afternoons, she often retreated to her private sitting room, where a modest wood fire burned in the iron, great to ward off the persistent chill of the old fortress. Here, she spent hours reading. Her preferences leaned toward bound volumes of French philosophy, the thick vellum pages turning softly in the quiet room. The leather bindings, stamped with faded gold lettering, offered a simple tactile comfort, grounding her in the calm, abstract logic of the texts. When the weather broke and the rain stopped, she walked the castle gardens. These were not the sprawling, wild hunting forests of the Danish court, but carefully manicured grounds designed for quiet, solitary contemplation. Her footsteps crunched rhythmically along the pale gravel paths, a steady, isolated sound in the still air. She wore simple, dark gowns of heavy wool or unadorned silk, devoid of the complex embroidery and stiff, wide hoops required for court appearances. This simpler dress allowed her to move easily among the sculpted hedges and still water features. Gardeners would sometimes pause in their work, keeping their eyes respectfully lowered and their hats in their hands as the exiled woman passed by. Her presence, just a quiet, accepted fact of their daily routine. Her household at Cell was small, consisting only of a few ladies-in-waiting and the necessary domestic servants. They spoke in hushed, measured tones, maintaining a calm, orderly environment that stood in stark contrast to the violent end of her lover, Struensee, who had been publicly executed months prior. That brutal reality was simply left outside the castle walls. Inside, there was only the smell of beeswax polish rubbed into oak furniture, the ticking of clocks, and the daily delivery of meals, roasted meats, root vegetables, and dark bread that she often ate with little appetite. She wrote letters, maintaining a careful, measured correspondence with a few sympathetic relatives, but her ink and paper were heavily monitored, the wax seals inspected by guards before leaving the gates. This quiet existence lasted only 3 years. In the spring of 1775, a sudden bout of scarlet fever swept through the castle. The end was swift, clinical, and largely unremarked upon by the wider world. Caroline Matilda died quietly in her bedchamber, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the bright, pale light of May. There were no state mourning periods declared in Denmark, no grand processions, no tolling of the cathedral bells in Copenhagen. The aftermath of her death was handled with the same quiet efficiency as her banishment. In the days that followed, minor officials arrived to systematically sort through her meager belongings. Her letters, her journals, and the bound volumes of French philosophy were gathered from the tables and shelves. They were placed into sturdy wooden crates, the rough pine boards smelling sharply of fresh sawdust. The crates were nailed shut. The flat, heavy blows of the hammer echoing loudly in the suddenly empty rooms. Finally, the seams were sealed with thick red wax bearing the royal crest, ensuring no remaining secrets could slip out. These boxes were loaded onto waiting carts to be sent back to the royal archives, locking away the last physical traces of the Queen and leaving the rooms of Cell Castle to the dust and the silence once more. The dust settling in Cell Castle was just one method of erasure, a sudden and permanent exile reserved for the most public of fractures. Far more common in the palaces of Europe was the temporary vanishing. When a queen or a princess found herself carrying a child that could not be claimed by her husband, the logistics of concealment required swift, quiet precision. The royal court was a crowded, endlessly observant space filled with ladies-in-waiting who dressed the royal women, laundresses who washed their linens, and idle courtiers who watched their silhouettes for signs of an heir. A pregnancy could only be hidden in these bustling corridors for a few short months before the thickening of the waist and the heaviness of the step betrayed the truth, before the physical evidence became undeniable. A sudden need for fresh air or a change of climate was formally announced. The royal woman would be quietly relocated to a distant rural hunting lodge or an older, unfashionable estate far from the capital. The journey would be made with a severely reduced household, leaving behind the gossiping crowds and the bright lights of the court. These rural retreats were often cold and sparsely furnished, built for brief, boisterous autumn hunting parties rather than long, sedentary stays. days stretched out in quiet isolation, the rooms smelling of damp wool, wood smoke, and old floorboards. Here, she would pass the heavier months of her undocumented pregnancy, walking slowly in walled gardens out of sight of the local villagers, waiting for her time to come. The birth itself was a stark contrast to the highly public spectacle of a legitimate royal delivery, where ministers, bishops, and extended family crowded into the bedchamber to witness the arrival of a recognized heir. In these distant lodges, the rooms were kept dark, the heavy oak doors guarded by a few trusted retainers. The physical pain and danger of childbirth remained exactly the same, but it was endured in a heavy, deliberate silence. There were no bells rung in the capital, no cannons fired from the fortress walls to announce a safe delivery. There was only the quiet clearing of linens, the washing of wooden floors, and the immediate practical problem of the infant. The child could not remain at the lodge. Long before the birth, discreet inquiries would have been made in the surrounding farming villages to find a healthy woman who had recently given birth herself. This wet nurse would be brought to the estate, often arriving at the kitchen doors in the quiet hours just before dawn. She was not told the true identity of the mother, though the fine, soft quality of the swaddling clothes and the oppressive secrecy of the great house likely spoke for themselves. In exchange for taking the child, she was paid in heavy, unmarked silver coins pressed directly into her hands. There were no stamped papers, no royal seals on this transaction. It was an arrangement built entirely on the weight of the metal and the clear understanding that she was to ask no questions and either raise the child quietly alongside her own or hand it over to a designated rural monastery. Back in the capital, the long-term financial architecture of this silence was being carefully constructed by trusted court lawyers. These men specialized in drafting complex settlements that obscured the true nature of the arrangement. Funds were quietly diverted from private royal purses, dipping into personal accounts that were not subject to the scrutiny of the state treasury or the oversight of parliamentary committees. They drew up land deeds and annuities using aliases, false titles, or holding companies, ensuring that a steady stream of income would reach the child's caretakers without ever trailing back to the crown. The documents were written in dry, dense legal phrasing outlining lifelong comforts in exchange for lifelong silence. The lawyers calculated exactly how much coin was required to ensure the child would be well fed, educated, and eventually apprenticed or married off, effectively absorbing them into the quiet current of the ordinary citizenry. The royal mother, meanwhile, would recover her strength in the damp isolation of the hunting lodge. Once her corsets could be laced tightly again, and her heavy silk gowns fit smoothly over her waist once more, she would return to the capital. She would step back into the brightly lit halls of the court, as if she had merely been resting, leaving no trace of the child behind except a slow, steady drain on a secret treasury ledger. Sometimes, the concealment of a private life took a more formal, if equally shadowed, shape. For a royal widow or a princess quietly stepping away from the primary line of succession, companionship could be legitimized through a morganatic union. These were marriages of the left hand. They offered a semblance of domestic regularity, sanctioned by the church, but strictly contained by the law of the state. There would be no grand procession, no days of public feasting, and no foreign ambassadors waiting in the wings to record the geopolitical implications. Instead, these unions were arranged in the deep privacy of family chapels, often tucked away in the older, colder, and lesser used wings of a rural estate. The ceremonies themselves were usually conducted in the dim, gray light of the early morning, long before the rest of the court awoke and began the rigid choreography of their daily routines. The hour was chosen for its heavy stillness, a time when the stone corridors were entirely empty except for the night guards, whose discretion had already been secured with small pouches of silver. The royal woman would dress simply for the occasion. She wore dark, heavy fabrics, perhaps a thick wool or a stiff, unadorned velvet, which offered practical warmth against the chill of the unheated chapel, rather than the gold-threaded silks she was required to wear in public. The air in these private sanctuaries held a particular quiet quality at that hour. It smelled heavily of cold stone and damp wool, mixed with the faint, metallic scent of old brass fixtures and the lingering, sweet smoke of snuffed beeswax candles from the previous evening's vespers. The royal bride and her chosen groom would kneel on the hard wooden steps before the altar, the silence broken only by the rustle of their heavy garments and the quiet clearing of a throat. There were no choirs to fill the vaulted ceilings with song, and no crowds of nobility to bear witness. A local priest, perhaps a trusted family confessor, who understood the delicate and absolute nature of his task, would stand before them in his simple vestments. He would quickly read through the standard liturgy of marriage, his voice kept to a low, steady murmur that echoed softly against the empty wooden pews. The vows exchanged in that cold room were exactly the same as those spoken by any commoner in the realm, binding two people together in the eyes of God. Yet, the physical reality of the moment was starkly utilitarian. It was a quiet, efficient transaction of souls, performed in the shadows, while the world outside slowly turned toward the dawn. Once the religious rite was concluded, the true architecture of the arrangement had to be secured on paper in a small adjacent study or a nearby drawing room, where a fire might finally be lit in the grate. A trusted notary would be waiting with the necessary documents. The legal phrasing drawn up for these occasions was meticulous and unyielding. It was an exercise in precise exclusion, written in dense, curling script on heavy sheets of vellum. The contract explicitly stated that the marriage, while spiritually complete and legally binding, carried no transfer of dynastic rank. The husband, if he were of lower birth, would not share his wife's royal status, nor would he gain any claim to the privileges of the court. More importantly, the documents laid out the exact future of any children born to the union. The phrasing carefully built an impenetrable wall between the private family and the public crown. These children would be legally acknowledged, often bearing a newly invented surname, but they would remain entirely barred from the royal succession. They could not inherit titles. They could not lay claim to the national treasury, and their names would not be recorded in the official genealogies kept by the state heralds. Instead, the contracts provided for their material comfort through alternate, quieter means. They were granted rights to inherit specific, privately held assets. This usually meant rural property, working farms, or minor country estates that generated a reliable income. The royal mother would settle a portion of her personal wealth, perhaps a modest hunting lodge surrounded by timber forests, or a manor house bordered by sheep pastures, upon her new family. This meticulous paperwork ensured that her offspring would live comfortably as minor gentry, their days measured by the agricultural seasons rather than the exhaustion of court diplomacy, safely insulated from the dangerous currents of royal ambition. These careful legal arrangements, the property deeds, and the discreet allowances meant to provide for an unacknowledged child did not simply vanish once the ink dried. The empire ran on paper, and every quiet banishment, every sudden relocation to a distant province, and every pension paid to a rural wet nurse required meticulous documentation. Clerks sitting at slanted wooden desks in drafty palace corridors transcribed these agreements in dense, looping script, blowing fine sand across the wet ink to dry it. Once completed, the documents were folded, tied with linen tape, and sent to join the vast accumulation of imperial memory, a repository of paper that would eventually outlast the dynasty itself. Today, the evidence of these obscured lives rests in the Habsburg archives in Vienna. Beneath the grand stone architecture of the city, vast underground rooms stretch out in quiet, orderly lines. These subterranean chambers are carefully climate controlled, maintaining a constant, cool temperature and a precise level of humidity to prevent the fragile history of the empire from crumbling into dust. Floor to ceiling, the heavy metal shelving units are filled with the state papers and the private correspondence of a family that ruled vast swaths of Europe for centuries. Walking through these silent, dimly lit aisles, one is surrounded by millions of pages, millions of days recorded and filed away in identical archival boxes and thick bound ledgers. The air in these underground vaults carries a very particular scent. It is the dry, papery smell of decaying leather bindings, of old animal glue slowly breaking down over the decades, and of brittle parchment oxidizing in the dark. Despite the gentle hum of modern ventilation and the careful preservation efforts of the archivists, there is always a fine layer of dust that settles over the records. It forms a soft gray film resting on the top edges of boxes that have sat completely untouched for generations. When a researcher pulls one of these heavy ledgers from the shelf and opens the cover, the spine gives a soft, dry crack, releasing the faint odor of iron gall ink and centuries-old rag paper into the cool air of the room. this sprawling maze of documentation, the official state papers were kept strictly separate from the private matters of the ruling family. The domestic affairs of the dynasty were directed to the family archive, a deeply restricted collection where the true cost of imperial succession was tallied in quiet ink. It is on these specific shelves that one finds the private letters of anxious archduchesses, the discreet reports filed by court physicians regarding sudden, unexplained illnesses, and the personal financial ledgers detailing quietly arranged payments to remote convents. The clerks who managed these specific files were sworn to absolute secrecy, their entire livelihoods dependent on their ability to document a royal scandal, file it appropriately, and never speak its name aloud. When a particularly sensitive matter was finally concluded, when a wayward archduchess had been safely relocated to a Bohemian hunting lodge, or an inconvenient pregnancy had been successfully concealed in a Tyrolean manner, the corresponding paperwork was bundled together and secured. Officials would hold sticks of resinous sealing wax over a small candle flame, letting the heavy, viscous drops pool onto the overlapping edges of the vellum folders. A heavy brass signet ring was then pressed firmly into the hot, red wax, leaving the sharp, raised impression of the imperial crest. These thick seals ensured that the details of quiet banishments remained completely closed to the public eye, locking the truth behind a brittle red barrier that would shatter into fragments if tampered with. Once the wax cooled and hardened, the file was carried down into the archives and placed on a shelf in the dim, temperature-regulated quiet. In a very practical sense, this act of filing marked the end of the crisis. The scandal was neutralized, contained entirely within a few ounces of folded paper and dried ink. The woman at the center of the file might live out the rest of her decades in the quiet provinces, her days filled with embroidery, reading, and walks through the damp timber forests, entirely removed from the court that had exiled her. Meanwhile, her official existence in the capital was reduced to a dormant bundle of letters, tied with fading string, sleeping soundly in the vast, dusty dark of the underground vaults. As the centuries turned, and the 19th century established its particular brand of polite society, the mechanics of a royal disappearance shifted. The heavy stone walls of a convent were gradually replaced by the medicalized language of the era. When a princess or a duchess found herself carrying a child that could not be explained, the court physicians would be summoned. They would note a sudden frailty, a nervous exhaustion, or a weakness of the lungs that required immediate and prolonged intervention. The prescription was almost always the same, suggesting a sudden, necessary departure from the damp, crowded capital to seek the restorative climate of a distant spa town. The journey itself provided the first layer of isolation. By the middle of the century, these departures took place by rail. Heavy steam engines pulled private carriages out of the city stations in the early hours of the morning. The stone platforms still slick with dew. Inside the velvet-lined compartments, the rhythmic, metallic clatter of the wheels against the iron tracks offered a steady, droning lullaby over a journey of many days. The scenery outside the glass windows would slowly change from flat agricultural lands to the dark, rising slopes of the Alps. The air seeping in through the window frames grew colder, smelling faintly of coal smoke and the sharp, clean scent of pine needles. These alpine spa towns were designed for quiet recuperation, nestled deep within valleys, where the sun only reached the ground for a few hours each afternoon. The architecture was orderly, characterized by wide verandas, white stucco walls, and long gravel paths that crunched softly underfoot. A royal woman arriving in such a place would be settled into a secluded suite, attended only by a carefully selected handful of loyal staff. The cold mountain air was said to brace the constitution, while the deep silence of the ancient forests provided a natural barrier against the curious eyes of the court and the public. The daily routine of the rest cure was rigid, leaving little room for unscheduled visitors or letters. Mornings began early with the drinking of the local mineral waters. These waters were often tepid, tasting strongly of sulfur and iron, leaving a bitter, chalky film on the tongue. This was followed by a prescribed period of absolute rest beneath heavy wool blankets on a shaded balcony, breathing in the thin, frigid air. In the afternoons, the physicians required brisk walks along the designated woodland paths, the pace measured, the breathing counted. Every hour was accounted for, creating a perfect, impenetrable schedule of convalescence. Beneath this precise medical choreography lay the true purpose of the retreat. The months spent in the quiet isolation of the mountains aligned neatly with the final trimesters of a hidden pregnancy. The exhaustion, the physical heaviness, and the need for prolonged bed rest were readily attributed to the prescribed treatments. When the time came for the child to be born, the remote location ensured that the cries of an infant would not carry beyond the thick walls of a private chalet. Local midwives, often paid handsomely for their absolute silence, would be brought in through the back entrances in the quietest hours of the night, carrying their basic tools in leather bags. The recovery period blended seamlessly into the language of the spa. The physical toll of childbirth, the blood loss, the fever, and the slow healing of the body were managed under the guise of thermal baths and hydropathy. The royal woman would be subjected to cold water compresses, prolonged soaking in heated mineral pools, and strict dietary regimens of plain broths and boiled vegetables. To the outside world, she was simply a delicate lady, enduring a rigorous cure for her nerves. In reality, she was healing from a birth that officially never happened, her body mending in the quiet, damp rooms of the bathhouse, wrapped in heavy cotton towels. Eventually, the child would be quietly placed with a foster family in a neighboring village, or perhaps sent farther away to a rural vicarage, accompanied by a modest annuity paid through an anonymous bank draft. The mother, her figure restored, and her constitution pronounced thoroughly cured by the resident doctors, would pack her trunks. The journey back down the mountains would trace the same rhythmic path along the iron rails, the steady clack-clack carrying her back to the capital. She would return to the ballrooms and the drawing rooms, looking perhaps a little paler, a little quieter, but fully prepared to resume her place in the spotless narrative of the royal house. But for some women, the spa towns and the mountain retreats were not enough. There were those whose indiscretions were too grave, whose temperaments were too erratic, or whose mere presence posed an ongoing threat to the delicate mathematics of inheritance. For these inconvenient aunts, sisters, and occasionally even wives, a different kind of departure was arranged. They did not board a train for a seasonal cure with trunks full of silk dresses. Instead, they were driven in a closed carriage, often under the cover of a moonless night, deep into the isolated countryside. Their destination was a private manor, entirely hidden from the road by dense copses of yew and high brick walls topped with broken glass. These were the private asylums of the late 19th century, designed specifically for the quiet, permanent management of high-born women who needed to disappear. These institutions bore no resemblance to the chaotic, howling bedlams of earlier centuries. They were, above all things, profoundly quiet. The architecture mirrored that of a minor country estate, complete with a sweeping gravel drive and tall sash windows. But a closer look would reveal that the window panes were reinforced and the heavy oak doors were locked from the outside. Inside, the atmosphere was one of clinical, unyielding order. The air always carried the sharp, medicinal scent of carbolic soap, layered over the faint, warm smell of beeswax used to polish the long stretches of floorboards. It was a smell that spoke of hygiene, of discipline, and of a deliberate erasing of all that was organic or unpredictable. Life inside the manor was governed by a highly structured routine designed to soothe the nerves and impose a rigid predictability on days that might otherwise stretch endlessly into decades. The heavy brass clocks on the mantels dictated every movement. The women spent most of their waking hours in the day room, a large, well-lit space furnished with sturdy, comfortable chairs that were slightly too heavy to be easily thrown or overturned. Here, the hours were strictly divided. There was a time for silent reading from a carefully curated selection of morally uplifting texts, a time for needlepoint, and a time for simply sitting, watching the dust motes drift through the shafts of pale afternoon sunlight. Meals were served in a communal dining room under the watchful eyes of matrons in stiffly starched aprons. The food was plain, deliberately devoid of rich sauces or spices that the medical thinking of the day believed might inflame the passions. There were boiled meats, pale root vegetables, and weak tea, consumed to the soft clinking of silver on porcelain, as conversation was generally discouraged. Once a day, weather permitting, the residents were allowed out for mild garden exercise. They walked in small, supervised groups along manicured paths, tracing circles around a central lawn. The garden walls were high enough that only the sky and the uppermost branches of ancient oaks were visible, ensuring that the outside world remained entirely out of sight. At night, the women retired to individual chambers. The beds were narrow, comfortable, made up with heavily starched linen sheets that felt cool and crisp against the skin. The crispness of the linens, the rhythmic ticking of a clock down the hall, the quiet turning of a lock in the door. These were the sensory details of their new reality. Many of these women were perfectly sane. Some had borne a child out of wedlock, a child quietly given to a village family, while the mother was sent away to prevent further ruin. Others had engaged in affairs with men of lower stations, or simply refused to comply with the matrimonial arrangements made for them in the eyes of their families, and the physicians heavily compensated to agree with them. Such defiance was a form of madness in itself. Years would pass in this comfortable, permanent forgetfulness. The royal houses they came from would go on, celebrating weddings, coronations, and births, their official portraits showing no gaps where a sister or a daughter should have been. Letters written by the women in the asylum were often intercepted by the doctors and quietly burned in the grate, while the quarterly payments from the royal treasury arrived with unbroken punctuality. Decades would slip by in a blur of carbolic soap and silent garden walks, the women growing older in a place where time seemed to hold its breath. The scandals that had brought them there would fade from court gossip, then from living memory, leaving only the quiet, rhythmic routine of the house, the polished floors, and the slow, undisturbed drift of the passing days.